The final section of this unit is about economic activities of the South. We know some of this. This is probably common knowledge stuff, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. In the South, there were large areas of land that produced harvests of cash crops. For instance, we know that tobacco was the principal crop in Maryland and Virginia. It was sold in Europe. It tasted better than what was being produced in Europe. And there was the need for indentured servants and slaves that had to work the land. The plantation areas were just too large. Rice was the main crop in South Carolina and Georgia. They actually built rice paddies, and they found rice in these areas to be more profitable than tobacco. Unfortunately, again, because of the size of the land and the amount of crops, they had to rely heavily on slave labor. The slave trade. The slave trade, because the need for slaves was so great, it was a commodity, a product that had to be purchased. So to establish this, to make slaves available, we have what is known as triangular trade. There's going to be a map on the next page. It'll make more sense then. But triangular trade is a group, a group of trade routes between the West Indies, Europe and the colonies, and West Africa that transported not just slaves but other merchandise back and forth. Now the Middle Passage is considered, Middle Passage, key term, it's a route that brought Africans to the West Indies and into the colonies for slavery. It was by far the most inhumane aspect of the triangular trade. Now, as you see on this map, it forms a triangle. Different products and goods were shipped different locations. For instance, we shipped out of the colonies, we shipped items to England. They are raw goods, sugar, molasses, wood. That stuff was shipped to England, where they then processed it and would send things like chairs back or cabinets. Guns, cloth, iron, and beer would all be shipped into Africa. And out of Africa, you would have gold, ivory, spices, hardwoods that would go back up to England. But the Middle Passage is that piece that brings the slaves. Most slaves made a stop initially at the Caribbean islands, and then they would be traded on up into the colonies. Slaves, sugar, and molasses would all be shipped up here. So we can see that triangular trade really got this region of the world all interconnected. Now, most slaves did work on plantations, as you might have guessed, and most plantations had an overseer, key term, a hired man that was used to keep the slaves working hard. That was strictly their job. They weren't workers by any means. That blacks did the work. Overseers were to keep them working. Now, all the states that had slavery also instilled slave codes. These were laws that were used to keep the slaves both ignorant and cooperative. The whites in the colonies were fearful of slave uprisings because on many plantations, slaves could outnumber white people by as many as 20 to 1. So it's a very dangerous situation if you were a white person. Slaves could not leave without written permission. This is part of the slave codes. They must remain illiterate. They can't learn how to read or write. And there was severe punishment for violations of any of these codes. For instance, a minor offense meant that you would be whipped. And we're talking about you would be hung up and whipped. So you can't get away from it. You could be hanged or burned for serious crimes. And there was severe punishment for running away. For instance, your master could order the chopping off of half of your foot. Basically, if you don't have all of your feet, you can never run again. Other punishments included being sold or having members family members being sold away from you. So finally, we have criticisms of slavery. It's important to know that not everyone in the colonies believed in slavery. We can somewhat see that as we've already talked about the need for slavery. Those that didn't need slaves weren't as supportive. Certain religious groups disagreed completely with slavery. For instance, Puritans, Quakers, and Mennonites, which are a German religious group, all condemned slavery. They disagreed with it strongly. People of the North soon grew to hate slavery as well. They felt it was unfair that they had to pay employees to work in their businesses, while Southerners were able to use free labor. They found that to be a huge disadvantage to their economy and a huge advantage to the South. Now, there's a common misconception that everyone in the South believed in slavery. We know that simply isn't true. For instance, we talked about North Carolina. People in North Carolina did not have slaves. They didn't agree with slaves. They practiced subsistence farming for the most part. And so there's not everybody in the South believed in slavery. Many Southerners were not large plantation owners, especially as we get farther and farther away from the initial colonies, when it's settlers themselves that are coming into the new states. In the colonial period, we have huge land grants giving, in which the colonies give land. That slowly starts to decrease as there's an increase in statehood and as Americans are in charge of themselves. So the number of large plantation owners starts to decrease. However, the South believed that it was the main reason for their economic success, and they felt it was necessary. They knew that it was unjust, but they needed it to succeed. They needed it for their own survival. So at this point, we are finished with Colonial America. Please make certain that you take the last quiz, and we'll see you next time.